I have kept a ledger my whole life. Nails bought, calves lost, days since rain. Numbers don't lie the way people do, and they don't cry, and they don't leave. So when Martha Ward was buried on a Tuesday in the dry month, I wrote it down like everything else, M. Ward gone twos. And I told myself that was the worst line I'd ever set to paper. I was wrong. The worst line came 4 months later when I looked across a supper table at a family I'd known for 20 years and realized I could not count what was left. Because there was nothing on that table to count. No bread, no talk, no mother. Just a father staring at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger, and 3 children learning, one silent night at a time, how to become orphans while their daddy was still alive. This is the story of the woman who walked up that road when we had all quit expecting anyone. The woman half the county wouldn't sit beside. The woman who didn't say a word about grief, she just started cooking. I'm going to tell it plain the way I saw it, and I'll warn you now, I did not welcome her. I was one of the ones who got it wrong. The plate hit the wall about a hand's width from my head. Gravy, or what passed for gravy in that house those days, which was flour and drippings and not much mercy, slid down the timber in a slow brown tongue, and the tin plate rang once on the floorboards and rolled a lazy half circle and lay still. For a second nobody moved. The lamp guttered. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote asked its one question and didn't wait for an answer. Then Caleb Ward stood up so fast his chair went over backward. "I ain't eaten this," he said. 17 years old and already carrying his father's shoulders and none of his father's patience. "I ain't eaten this, and I ain't sittin' here pretendin' we're a family when we ain't nothin' anymore." "Sit down," Elias said. He didn't say it loud. That was the trouble with Elias Ward those months. He'd lost the loud. A man that big ought to be able to fill a room with a word, and once he could, but the word came out of him now like water out of a cracked jug, most of it leaking away before it reached you. "Sit down." Caleb didn't. He looked at the gravy on the wall, and then he looked at his father, and I watched something break behind that boy's eyes that I don't think ever fully mended. The moment a child stops being angry at his father and starts being angry for him, which is a worse and lonelier kind of anger because there's nowhere to put it. "She wouldn't have let us live like this," Caleb said, quiet now, which was worse. "Mama wouldn't have." Then he walked out. The screen door clapped behind him twice and went still. I sat there, old Webb cold iron ranch hand, 40 years in the saddle and no better at this than a fence post, and I did the only thing I knew how. I got out my little ledger from my vest pocket and I licked the pencil, and under the day's date I wrote, plate, wall, Caleb gone to the barn again. Third time this WK, because if I counted it maybe I could stand it. That's the deal I'd made with myself years back, and it had held up through drought and dead stock and one bad winter that took 4 good men off this range. It did not hold up against a family coming apart, but I didn't know that yet. I was still counting. Across the table, the 2 little ones hadn't moved. Ruth was 12 and had her mother's exact way of going still when the world got loud, folding her hands, dropping her eyes, disappearing while sitting right there in her chair. Since the funeral she'd taken over the mothering the way children do, badly and bravely, burning the biscuits and scrubbing her little brother's ears too hard and lying awake, I'd wager, listening for a cough in the next room that would never come again. 12 years old and running a house on grief and guesswork. She caught me looking and gave me a smile that wasn't a smile, just the shape of one, put on for my benefit, the way you'd hold up an empty cup and pretend to drink so as not to worry a guest. And then there was Sam. Sam was 6. Sam had not said one word since the day they put his mother in the ground. Not one. Not past the salt, not I'm cold, not why. The doctor down in Kenyatta had used a long Latin word for it, and then, when Elias just stared at him, had said in plain talk that some children lose their voice the way some folks lose the use of a leg, that it might come back on its own, or with time, or never. Elias had paid the man and rode home and hadn't spoken of it since. Sam ate what was put in front of him when there was anything to put. He followed Ruth around like a shadow. At night, they told me, he slept in his mother's old shawl, the one that still smelled of her for a while and then, cruelest of all, stopped. That night after the plate, Sam looked at the gravy on the wall for a long, long time. Then he got down from his chair and he picked up the tin plate off the floor and he set it careful back on the table in front of his father's place. Straightened it, like he was fixing something. Like if the plate was where it belonged, then maybe everything else could get back where it belonged too. Elias made a sound I'd never heard a man make. Then he got up and went out the other door, into the dark, and we heard him not go anywhere, just standing out there. A big man standing in his own yard with nowhere left in the whole world he wanted to be. I put the pencil away. Some things you don't write down. You need to understand how good it had been, or none of the rest of it will land. The Ward place sat in a fold of the Arizona hills where a spring ran most years, which is worth more than gold in that country and about as rare. Elias' daddy had broke it, and Elias had built it up good stock, a clean house, a barn that didn't lean. But it wasn't the ranch that made the place. It was Martha. Martha Ward could take flour, water, and salt and make you feel like your own mother had come back from wherever mothers go. She had a table. She had a literal table, long, hand-planed pine that Elias made her the first winter they were married, and around that table she gathered every soul who wandered up that road. Riders, drifters, the pearly boys when their own mama drank. Me, a broke-down cowhand with no people of my own, who she folded into that family so gentle I never noticed it happening until I looked up one day and realized I'd have died for any one of them. She fed people. That was her whole gospel, near as I could tell. She didn't preach it. She just believed down in her bones that no trouble on God's earth got worse for being faced across a full plate, and that a body who'd been fed, properly fed, sat down and looked in the eye and fed, was a body that remembered it was loved, and a body that remembered it was loved could survive most anything. She used to say it while she worked, half to herself. Webb, the table's the last thing that goes. Long as folks'll sit down together, they ain't beat yet. Then the fever came up from the low country in the wet part of summer, and it took her in 9 days, and Elias Ward, who could rope, ride, doctor a horse, break a colt, and stare down a bank man without blinking, sat by that bed and could not do one single thing. And when it was over, the table died with her. Oh, it stood there still, but nobody said it. Nobody gathered. They ate standing at the stove, or not at all, or bitter and separate like that night with the plate. Elias couldn't bear to sit at the head of it with the foot empty, so he mostly didn't sit at all. And a house where nobody eats together is a house that has already, in the way that matters, quit being a home. I'd watched it happen over 4 slow months. The talk went first, then the meals, then the looking at each other. By that dry autumn, the 4 of them lived in the same house like 4 candles in the same dark room, each burning down alone. I did what I could, which was nothing much. I mended what broke, and I said what a man like me knows how to say, which is not enough and never the right thing. I counted the days in my ledger. I watched Caleb harden and Ruth thin out and Sam go silent and Elias go somewhere behind his own face where none of us could follow. And then one evening near the end of that dry month, a woman came walking up the road on foot, carrying a bundle, and everything changed. Though God knows I fought it the whole way. I saw her before the others did. I was up on the ridge fixing a stretch of wire the antelope had come through, and I looked down the road that ran up from the Cañada Trail, and there was a figure walking, not riding, walking in that country in that heat, which meant either desperate or crazy or both. A woman by the shape of her, carrying something, moving slow but steady, the way you move when you've come a long way and mean to come a longer one before you quit. I watched her come, and when she got close enough that I could see her plain, my stomach did a thing I'm not proud of. She was Apache. Now I'll tell you the truth of me at that time, and you can think of me what you like. I'd fought them in my younger and stupider years in the campaigns, and I'd lost a friend or two, And I'd done things in those years I don't set down in any ledger. I carried it, the way men of my generation carried it, as a hardness, a wall, a thing I called knowing better that was really just fear wearing a workman's coat. I saw that woman walking up Elias Ward's road, and every hard old thing in me stood up at once. I came down off the ridge, faster than the wire deserved. By the time I got to the yard, she was already at the house. Elias had come out onto the porch. Ruth stood behind him in the doorway with Sam's face peering out from behind her skirt, and the woman had stopped a respectful distance off, the way you'd stop at a strange dog's fence, and set her bundle down, and she was speaking to Elias in careful, quiet English. "Work," she was saying. "I can work, I can cook and clean and mend. I ask food and a place to sleep, nothing more." She was maybe 30. Hard to say, that life ages the outside of a person and leaves the eyes younger than the face. Her dress was town cloth, worn near through, and she had a good wool shawl folded over the bundle that I'd learn later was near everything she owned. She stood straight. She didn't beg. She stated her terms like a person who has had to learn exactly what she is worth and refuses to sell for less, even hungry. "Where are your people?" Elias asked. Something crossed her face and was gone. "Gone," she said. "Scattered. San Carlos, some further." She didn't explain, and he didn't ask her to, and I understood, even in my ignorance, that a whole country of grief lived in that one flat word, scattered, and that she'd put it away in a box the same as Elias had put away his, and that maybe that was the first thing they ever had in common, though neither of them could have said so. "I got no money to pay a hand," Elias said. "Barely feedin' the ones I got." I did not ask money. "Elias," I said. I'd come up beside the porch. I said his name like a warning, like don't. "Elias, you can't." He looked at me. And the woman looked at me too, and I'll carry the look she gave me a long while, not anger, not even hurt, just a tiredness so old and so bottomless that it made my hard old fear feel like exactly the small and shabby thing it was. She'd seen 100 men like me. She knew the whole speech before I opened my mouth. She'd stopped expecting better a long time ago, and here it was again, right on schedule, and she just waited for it the way you wait out weather. But before I could make my speech, a small thing happened. Sam came out from behind his sister's skirt. He walked past his father, past me, straight across the porch and down the 2 steps into the yard, and he stopped in front of the strange woman and looked up at her. 6 years old, silent 4 months, and he reached up and touched the fringe of that wool shawl folded over her bundle, the same fringe his mother's shawl had, near enough, and he held on to it. Just held on, looking up at her with his whole ruined little heart in his face. The woman went very still. Then she knelt down, slow, so as to be level with him, and she didn't say anything, and she didn't pull the shawl away, and she didn't do that thing grown folks do where they get loud and false around a hurt child. She just knelt there and let him hold the fringe of her shawl, this boy she'd never seen, in the yard of a family that had every reason to turn her out. And I saw her jaw work once, and her eyes go bright, and she blinked it back the way you do when you've long since decided crying is a thing you cannot afford. Nobody said anything for a while. "He don't talk," Ruth said finally from the doorway. Her voice came out cracked. "Not since Mama, he don't talk to nobody." The woman looked at Sam holding her shawl. Then she looked up at Elias. "He does not need to," she said. And Elias Ward, who had not been able to say sit down loud enough to keep his own son at the table, looked at his silent boy holding onto a stranger's shawl, and something moved in that big grieving face. The first thing I'd seen move in it in 4 months. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "Was for stores, it's small." "It is enough," she said. "Elias," one more time, weaker. Even I could hear it dying in my throat. "Webb," he didn't look at me. "Go on and finish that wire." I went. God help me, I went. And I was angry the whole way up the ridge, angry the way a scared man is angry, muttering to my ledger and my fence and the indifferent hills. I told myself no good would come of it. I told myself the county would talk. I told myself a lot of things a man tells himself when he's about to be proven wrong and can feel it coming. I didn't write her down that night. Didn't have a name to write. It'd be 2 more days before I learned it. Her name was Sella. She started with bread. I want to be exact about this because it's the thing I understood latest and it's the thing that mattered most. She did not start with a speech. She did not gather the children and tell them it was time to heal, that their mother would want them to be a family, all the useless true things people say. She did not try to be Martha. If she had, they'd have hated her for it, and rightly. She started with bread. The first morning, I came in for coffee, cold coffee. We drank it cold and bitter those days because nobody had the heart to tend a proper fire, and the kitchen was warm. The stove was going, and there was a smell in that house I hadn't smelled since July. Rising bread. Sella stood at Martha's work table. Not the long pine table. She was careful, I noticed, careful as a person crossing a river on stones. Never once that first week did she touch the family table or set a thing on it. She stood at the side work table with her sleeves pushed up and flour to her elbows, working dough with the heels of her hands, and she looked up when I came in and she said, "Coffee is fresh. On the stove. Not friendly, not unfriendly, just so." I did not thank her. I'm ashamed to say it, but I won't lie in my own telling. I poured the coffee hot, real, the first hot coffee in that house since summer, and I drank it standing by the door like she might poison me, and I watched her work and I looked for the trick in it. The angle, what she was really after. Because a hard, scared man can't believe a kindness. He has to find the price tag or it drives him crazy. I didn't find one, she just made bread. The children came down one at a time, drawn by the smell like the rest of us, animals to warmth. Ruth first, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her thin chest, watching this stranger stand where her mother used to stand, and I watched jealousy and hunger fight it out on that 12-year-old face. Because she wanted to hate it and she wanted, so bad, to be 12 again and smell bread in the morning and not be the one responsible for everyone. Sella didn't push. She said, "The first loaf is near done. If someone were to butter it while it's hot, that would be the best of it. Not would you." Just laid the possibility down in the middle of the room like a coin on a table and let Ruth decide whether to pick it up. Ruth picked it up, slow, suspicious. She got the butter crock, and when that first loaf came out of the oven, dark and steaming and right, Sella cut the heel of it, the best part, the cook's part, the part the woman of the house always keeps for herself, and she handed it to Ruth without a word. And Ruth, who I had not seen eat a full meal in 4 months, who had been feeding everyone but herself, who was disappearing an ounce at a time, Ruth ate that heel of hot bread standing in the kitchen with butter running down her wrist, and she closed her eyes, and for about 10 seconds she got to be a child again. I had to go check on the horses, something in my eye. Caleb was the hard case. He came in last from the barn where he'd taken to sleeping, and he saw Sella and his whole body went rigid. 17 and grief-mad and looking for somewhere to aim all that hurt, and here was a target the whole world would have told him was fair game. "We don't need you," he said, cold. "We were doing fine." Sella looked at him. She looked at his thin frame and the dark under his eyes and the anger he was wearing like his daddy's too big coat, and she did not flinch, and she did not soften, and she did not fight. "You were not," she said simply, "but you are still standing, that is not nothing." Then she set a plate of bread on the worktable near him, not handed to him, he'd have thrown it. Near him, and she turned her back and went on with her work, as if she had all the time in the world and no interest at all in whether he ate. He didn't eat it, not that morning. He stood there glaring at the back of her head, and then he took the bread, took it, meaning to make some point about it, I think, meaning to throw it to the chickens in front of her, and he got as far as the door, and I watched from the yard as that starving boy stood on the porch with a piece of warm bread in his hand, and his mother 4 months dead, and no one watching, or so he thought. He ate it fast, turned away like it was a crime, wiped his mouth on his sleeve hard like he could wipe off the wanting. I wrote in my ledger that night, and what I wrote was, bread. All four ate. First time since. And then I sat looking at that line a long while by the lamp, because I realized it was the first line in 4 months that wasn't a subtraction. Here is the part where I have to tell on myself, because it's the truth and because you'd find me a coward if I hid it, and I'd rather you find me a fool who learned than a coward who didn't. I went to town that week, Kenyatta, for nails and coffee and to have the horses looked at, and while I was there I did what small men do, I talked. Not cruel. I want to say it wasn't cruel, but that's the coward talking again. I stood in Holly's store, and when Holly's asked how the wards were bearing up, I said Elias had took on help, and Holly said good God knows they need it, and I said, and here's the shameful part, I said low, like it was a thing to be low about. She's a squaw. Apache. Come up the road on foot. I watched it move through that store. I watched the word do its ugly work. Mrs. Purley pursed her mouth. Old Deacons by the stove said something I won't repeat. And Holly's, who was a decent enough man, gave me a look that had disappointment in it and said, well, Elias' business, I reckon, in a tone that meant it was about to be everybody's business. I rode home feeling righteous, which is how you feel right before you find out you were wrong. I'd warned them, see. I'd done my duty by the county. I'd protected something, I couldn't have told you what. My own hard heart, probably. The wall I'd built out of dead friends and old fear that I mistook for wisdom. It took 8 days for the county to come calling, but it did come. They always do. And by the time it came, Sella had done a thing to that house that I hadn't let myself see happening, because I was too busy in town making sure the world knew what she was. She'd started setting the table. It was small at first. A week in, maybe 8 days. I came in at dusk, and the long pine table, Martha's table, that had stood dead and bare since July, had a cloth on it, just a plain cloth. And plates. 4 plates, and then, after a pause, I could feel her take a 5th for me and a 6th. 6 plates around Martha's table, set proper, and food in the middle of it, a stew, bread, greens she'd found God knows where in that dry country. And here's the thing. She didn't announce it. She didn't ring a bell and call everyone to the healing supper. She just set the table and lit the lamp and started serving herself a plate, alone, at the foot, not the head, never the head. She took the foot where the empty chair had been, the mother's place. And I saw the courage that took, to sit in the dead woman's chair in the dead woman's house and eat alone if she had to. And one by one, drawn by the light and the smell and the plain animal fact of a set table, they came. Ruth first. Then Sam, who climbed into his chair and reached over and straightened his father's empty plate the way he always did. Then Caleb, glowering, sitting as far down as he could get, but sitting. And last, from the dark of the yard where he'd taken to standing, Elias Ward. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at his table set, lit, full, his children around it and the foot no longer empty. And I watched that man's face do something that took the better part of a minute, like watching ice go out of a river in spring, all groaning and cracking and slow. Then he came and he sat down at the head of his own table, first time since July. Nobody said grace. Nobody said much of anything. But we ate, all of us together in the light, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was the first miracle I'd witnessed in my long, hard life. And I didn't deserve to be at that table, and I knew it, because 8 days before I'd stood in Holly's store and helped load the gun that was, right that minute, being pointed up our road. Sam didn't talk, but partway through the meal he did a thing. He looked down the table at Sella in his mother's chair, and he pushed his cup of milk toward her just a little, just an inch, an offering, the only language he had left. And Sella looked at that inch of pushed milk like it was the whole world handed over, and she said, quiet, "Thank you, Sam," using his name, and something in her voice was not steady. I wrote it that night, table set, all 6 ate together. Sam offered milk. And then I sat there and I could not write the next part, which was what I'd done in town, so I didn't. I left it out of the ledger, which is the first time in 40 years I ever left out a true thing on purpose. You can't count your way out of shame. I was starting to learn that. They came on a Sunday. 3 of them, riding up the road midday, deacons, and one of the Pearly men, and a fellow named Cutter who did the county's dirty talking for it, the kind of man who's always appointed himself to speak for decency and always smells of something else underneath. They rode up slow and stopped in the yard and didn't get down, which is its own kind of insult, staying horsed like they might have to leave in a hurry, like the ground itself was suspect. Elias came out. I came out behind him, and I want it known that I stood behind him and not beside those 3, though by rights of what I'd done in town I belonged with them, and they knew it, and Cutter gave me a nod like we were partners in something, and my stomach turned over. Elias, Cutter said, word is you've took on an Apache in the house with the children. That's my business, Elias said. It's the county's business when. It's my business. A little of the loud was back in him, just a little, but I heard it and so did they. Cutter tried a different road. Folks are only concerned, Elias. Woman like that alone up here with young'uns and their mama not cold in the ground. It don't look right. There's talk. For the children's sake. Don't. Elias took one step forward and Cutter's horse felt something and shifted. Don't you say for my children's sake. You don't know one thing about my children. I know that boy don't talk, Cutter said. Whole county knows it. That ain't natural, Elias and Letton. And that's when the door opened behind us, and Sella came out onto the porch. She wasn't hiding. That struck me. She could have stayed in the kitchen and no one would have faulted her and it would have been the safe thing. But she came out and stood on the porch in her worn town dress with her chin up, and she looked at those 3 men on their horses, and she didn't say a word because she'd learned long ago that her words wouldn't count for anything with men like these. She just stood, present, refusing to be talked about as if she weren't there. And behind her, holding onto her skirt the way he used to hold onto Ruth's, came Sam. Cutter looked at the boy. Come here, son, he said, gentling his voice, the false gentle I'd heard the doctor use. Come on over here away from. And Sam looked at that man. This silent, wrecked, 6-year-old boy looked up at the 3 men who'd ridden into his yard to take away the first warm thing that had happened to his family since his mother died. And he opened his mouth. And he said no. One word, cracked and rusty and small as a bird. The first word out of that child in 4 months. And he said it holding onto Sella's skirt with both hands, and he said it to a grown man on a horse, and he said it like it cost him everything he had, which it did. No. The yard went dead silent. I heard my own heart. I heard, behind me, a sound come out of Elia's ward that I won't try to spell. I saw Ruth appear in the doorway with both hands over her mouth. I saw Caleb come around the corner of the barn at a dead run because he'd heard it too, heard his baby brother's voice for the first time since July, and stop cold at the corner of the house with his mouth open. And I saw Sella. She didn't move. She didn't grab the boy up or make a show. But one of her hands came down, slow, and rested on Sam's head in his hair, and I saw her fingers tremble, and I saw her look straight at Cutter with a face carved out of 4 months of being talked about in her hearing as if she were furniture. And finally, having in this one small boy a reason to be looked at as something more. Cutter didn't have anywhere to go with it. You can't argue with a child's first word. Even a man like that couldn't, not with 3 witnesses and a father behind the boy. He sat his horse a moment longer, mouth working, and then he said something about how it was Elias' own funeral and jerked his horse's head around too hard and rode out, and the other 2 followed, and the dust of them hung in the yard a while and then it settled, and it was quiet. Sam was crying now. The way you cry when a thing that's been stopped up for 4 months finally breaks loose, great silent heaves, no sound to them even now, but tears coming and coming. And Sella knelt down in the dirt of that yard and gathered him in finally, all the way. And Elias came off the porch and got down on his knees beside them both and put his arms around his son and the stranger both at once. And Ruth ran to them. And even Caleb came, slow, from the corner of the barn, even Caleb, and got down in the dirt with the rest of his broken, mending family. And I stood off to the side, where I belonged, the man who'd gone to town and talked, watching a family I'd near helped to break get put back together by a woman I'd tried to turn out, over a boy who just spent his first word in 4 months on the word no. No, you can't have this, no, you can't take her, no. I got out my ledger. My hands weren't steady. I turned to the shameful page, the one where 8 days back I'd left out what I did in town. And I wrote it in, the whole of it, went to Kenyatta, told Hollies, told them what she was, brought this down on them. I set my shame in the book in my own hand where I'd have to see it. Because Martha used to say the table's the last thing that goes, and I understood finally, standing in that yard, what she'd been trying to teach me all those years. That a man can be fed at a table for 20 years and still not learn the lesson of it until he watches a stranger set it for people he loves, in a house that had quit believing anyone ever would. Sam said one word that day. I'd like to tell you it was the last of the trouble. That the county left them be, that Caleb's anger melted clean away, that Sella found her place easy and stayed, and there was nothing more to fear. But I keep an honest ledger now, so I'll tell you true. What came up that road next was worse than 3 men on horses. And Sella, who'd walked into our lives carrying everything she owned in one bundle, hadn't yet told us the one thing about herself that would put the whole fragile table at risk of tipping over again. She'd told us her people were scattered. She hadn't told us that some of them were still looking for her. The widower thought his family was falling apart. Then she filled the table with love. The letter came in October, and it was Caleb who brought it up the road, and I knew before he reached the yard that something in it had already gone wrong, because the boy was riding too fast for good news and too slow for the worst kind, which is the pace a man takes when he's carrying a thing he wishes he could set down and can't. He'd been to Kenyatta for the mail, a chore he'd taken to volunteering for, which nobody remarked on out loud but everybody understood. Caleb went to town because Caleb was the one who could stand it. Ruth wouldn't go anymore, not after a woman outside the church had said a thing to her about that squaw living in your dead mama's kitchen. And Ruth had come home white and shaking and hadn't told anyone but me. And I'd written it in my ledger and then sat up half the night with a fury in me I had no right to, being the man who'd started that particular fire in Hollies' store back in the dry month. So Caleb went, 17 and hard-jawed and daring anybody to say it to his face. And mostly they didn't, because there's a kind of quiet in a grieving boy that even mean people know to step around. He swung down in the yard and he didn't hand me the mail sack the way he usually did. He stood there holding one letter apart from the rest, turning it over, and he said, "Webb, this one. It ain't for Pa." He looked up at me and there was something scared in it under the hard. "It's for her." I took it. The hand it was addressed in was careful, school-teacher careful, the hand of somebody who'd learned their letters late and prized them. And the name on it, not Sella, not any name I'd have known, was in a language I couldn't read, and under it, in English, a woman's name and San Carlos agency, Arizona Territory, and I understood 2 things at once: that it had come a long way, and that whoever'd sent it had known exactly where to find her, which meant Sella had written first, which meant Sella had reached back toward the scattered people she'd told us were gone, and had said nothing to any of us about it. I want to tell you I gave it straight to her, clean, no thought in my head but her right to her own mail. But the old fear stood up in me one more time. Who is she really? Who's she in with? What's coming up this road behind this letter? And I stood in the yard a full minute with a woman's private letter in my hand, weighing whether to take it to Elias first. I didn't. I'd learned that much at least, small progress in an old dog. I found her in the garden patch she'd made behind the kitchen. She'd coaxed a fall garden out of that stingy ground where Martha's had gone to weeds, squash and beans and a few late greens, working it in the cool of the day, and I held the letter out and I said, "Come for you." She wiped her hands on her apron. She saw the hand it was written in and her whole body changed. Not a big thing. Just she got very still, the way Sam got still. The way I'd learn was a thing you did when you'd survived enough that stillness was the only safe first response to anything. She took it. She didn't open it in front of me. "Thank you, Webb," she said. She'd taken to using my name a while back. It still landed strange on me every time, being named kindly by a woman I'd tried to run off. "Sella, I didn't know what I meant to ask. That come from?" "My sister," she said. And that was all. She folded the letter into her apron pocket and turned back to the beans, and her back said the conversation was done. And I let it be done, and I went and I wrote in my ledger letter came. Her sister. San Carlos. She said nothing more, and I underlined nothing more twice, and I did not sleep easy on it. Because a scattered people, it turns out, is not the same as a lost one. And a sister who can write is a sister who can send for you. And I had watched, over 3 good months, this woman knit a broken family back together thread by thread, and it had not once occurred to me, fool that I was, that she might have a family of her own somewhere, pulling at her from the other direction. I've got to double back now and tell you about the months between, or you won't understand what was at stake when the past finally came up that road. Because the September and the early October of that year were, I believe, the best weeks the Ward place had known since Martha died. And they were quiet weeks. That's the thing about them. They were made of small, ordinary stuff, and it's the small, ordinary stuff that turns out to be the whole of a life when you look back. Sella never tried to be their mother. I said that before, and it holds. What she did was harder and rarer. She made a place, a warm one, a fed one, a place with bread rising and the table set, and then she stood a little to the side of it and let each of those hurt people walk into that warmth at their own pace and take what they needed from it. Ruth got to be 12 again. That was the one that healed fastest, and it was a sight to see. Sella never once took the housework away from the girl like it was a rebuke. Instead, she made it something they did together, 2 women in a kitchen, and she taught Ruth things a mother teaches: how to know good dough by the feel and not the clock, how to sharpen a knife on a stone, how to sit with a thing that's simmering and not fret it. And in the doing of it, Ruth quit being the small, grim mistress of a failing house and got to be a girl learning at a woman's elbow, and the color came back into her. And one afternoon in late September, I heard a sound from the kitchen I hadn't heard in that house in a year. Ruth laughing. I stood in the yard and I did not go in, because some sounds you don't want to interrupt, and I got out my ledger and I couldn't think how to count a laugh, so I just wrote the date and Ruth in the kitchen, and figured whoever read my ledger after I was gone could puzzle out the rest. Sam started talking, slow, in pieces. After that one word in the yard, it was like a jug tipped over inside him, but tipped slow, a little running out at a time. First just to Sella and just needs water cold up, and then to Ruth, and then, weeks on, one evening at supper, to his father. He looked down the table at Elia's and he said, "Pa, can I have the bread?" A whole sentence, and Elia's Ward, this mountain of a man, had to get up and go out to the porch a minute before he could come back and pass his son the bread. And when he did, his hand wasn't steady, and nobody said a word about it, which was its own kind of grace. Caleb was the slow thaw. Of course he was. He had the most anger because he'd taken the most on himself, blaming his own self somewhere down deep for not saving his mother, the way the oldest child always does, carrying a debt that was never theirs. And he couldn't forgive Sella easy, because forgiving her meant admitting the house had needed saving, and admitting the house had needed saving meant admitting he hadn't been able to save it, and a 17-year-old would rather stay angry forever than sit with that. What turned him wasn't a big scene, it was a horse. There was a colt Elias had been meaning to break before Martha got sick and hadn't touched since. A good young bay gone half wild from neglect, mean now and dangerous, and Elias couldn't face it because it was one more thing from before, one more thing Martha had watched him work in the spring of the year she died. And Caleb, being Caleb, decided one morning he'd break it himself, alone, to prove something to somebody, probably his dead mother, and he got dumped hard against the corral rails and came up with his arm hanging wrong and his face gray. And it was Sella who came over the fence. Not to fuss him. She came over that fence and she took hold of that arm dislocated at the shoulder. I could see it from where I stood frozen, and she looked at Caleb, who was 17 and in agony and too proud to make a sound, and she said, "Lo, this will hurt. Once. Then it will stop. Look at me, not at it." And she set that shoulder with a move I'd only ever seen an army surgeon do. One clean pull and turn. And Caleb made a sound like a man and not a boy. And then it was back in, and the worst of it was over. And he sat there in the dirt breathing hard with his shoulder screaming and his eyes streaming and his pride in ruins. And Sella, kneeling in front of him, said the thing that turned him. She didn't say they're there. She didn't say you shouldn't have. She said, "Your mother, when you were small. Did she ever tell you a thing you were too young to hear and you carry it still and it is too heavy?" Caleb looked at her. "You are carrying something too heavy," she said. "It is not the horse. I have carried mine a long way. I know its weight in another person." She stood up. She put out her hand to help him up, and for a second I didn't think he'd take it, and then he did, and she pulled him to his feet, and she said, "The horse is afraid because it was left alone too long with no one gentle. That is all, you know this. You have been that horse." And she walked back to the kitchen and left him standing there with his arm in a sling she'd fashioned, and his whole hard front cracked down the middle. He broke the colt 3 weeks later, gentle, the way she'd said. And the day he finally rode it easy around the corral, he looked over to the kitchen window without meaning to, checking if she'd seen the way a boy checks if his mother saw, and she had, and she lifted one hand, and he looked away quick and pretended he hadn't been looking, but I saw. I wrote it down. Caleb rode the bay, looked for her to see. That's how you'd know it had happened if you were a man who counted things. Not by anything anybody said, by who they looked for to see them do the thing. And Elia's. I've circled this because it's the tenderest part and the hardest to tell without making it into something cheap, which it never was. There was nothing improper between Elia's ward and Sella in those months. I want that plain. The county said what the county said, and the county lied, the way it always does about lonely people. What was actually between them was slower and stranger than anything the county could imagine, because the county could only imagine one kind of thing between a man and a woman under one roof, and this was not that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I don't know how it would have gone, and I'll get to why I don't know. What was between them was grief that recognized grief. He'd lost a wife. She'd lost, I didn't know the whole of it yet, but I'd started to guess from the shape of her stillnesses. She'd lost a world, a people, a place, a way of living, and things she never named that were worse than any of those. And two people who have each survived the end of their whole world can sit together in a kind of quiet that nobody who hasn't been through it can share. That's what they had. In the evenings, after the children were down, they'd sit at the two ends of that long table, him at the head, her at the foot, the exact geography of the family, and I don't think either of them ever once remarked on how they'd fallen into a husband's chair and a wife's, and they wouldn't talk much. He'd mend tack, she'd mend clothes, and the lamp would burn, and sometimes an hour would go by with nothing said, and it was the most peaceful thing in that whole hard country. One night I came in for something, and I heard them talking, low, and I stopped in the dark of the hall because I'm not proud, and I listened. "Buried her under the cottonwood," Elias was saying. "By the spring. She liked it there. I go out and I talk to her sometimes, like a fool." "It is not foolish," Sella said. "I talk to mine also, to the ones I could not bury." A long quiet. "How many?" Elias said. Not really a question, an offering you can tell me or not. And Sella was quiet a while, and then she said, in that flat put-away voice she used for the unbearable things, "My husband, my son, he was 4. A pause you could have driven a wagon through. The soldiers, and then the fever after in the moving. The moving killed more than the soldiers. They marched us and the children could not," and she stopped, and she didn't finish it, and Elias didn't make her, and I stood in that dark hall with my hand over my own mouth. A son, 4 years old. That was why she'd knelt so easy in the yard that first day and let a strange, silent boy hold the fringe of her shawl and hadn't pulled away. She'd had a boy that age. She'd lost him on a road in the cold in a moving that killed the children. And I had stood in Holly's store and called her a squaw and helped set the county on her. And she had come into a house of grief and fed our grief while carrying that, all of that, folded up small in her apron pocket like a letter she couldn't afford to open. I went back out to the barn and I did not write anything that night. I sat in the dark with my ledger shut on my knee, and I thought about all the things I'd counted in my life that didn't matter and the one or two that did, and how a man can go 60 years and learn the difference too late. So now you know what was in that October letter near enough before I ever read it, which I did eventually because Sella showed it to me. That's the part that still gets me, that she showed me of all the people on that place. I asked her later why. She said, because you write things down, and I wanted one true account of it to exist somewhere in case. She didn't finish in case. She'd stopped finishing a lot of sentences and I'd learned to hear the ends of them anyway. The letter was from her sister, whose name was Dossie, at the San Carlos agency. And the news in it was this. The agency was letting some families go to a new allotment, real land, a chance to stop being penned, and Dossie had a place in it, and a husband and children. And Dossie had written, there is room for you, sister. Come. We are the last two. Come and be with your own people before we are both old. You have grieved alone long enough among strangers. Come and be with your own people. I read that line by lamplight with Sella sitting across from me at the foot of the table, and I understood the whole shape of the trap she was in, and it near tore me apart because there was no villain in it. That was the cruelty. Her sister wasn't wrong. A woman ought to be with her own people. A woman who'd lost a husband and a son and a whole world had every right on God's earth to go to the last blood she had left and grow old beside her, on land that was theirs, among faces that knew her name, her real name, the one I couldn't read, the one this family had never even asked her for. And here she had a storeroom bed and a family that wasn't hers, in a house that had a dead woman's fingerprints on every board, in a county that called her a squaw outside the church, doing a mother's work for children she had no claim to and would have no claim to, watching a man grieve a wife she could never replace and wouldn't want to, aging in a borrowed kitchen among people who, most of them, had wanted her gone from the start. Put like that, it wasn't even a choice. Any sensible woman would go. When will you tell them? I asked. My voice came out rough. I have not decided to go, she said. You have not decided to stay, I said, and she looked at me, and I'd caught it right, and neither of us said anything else about it that night. She didn't decide for 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks a hard thing happened that I've got to tell, because it's the thing that finally forced her hand, and it's the thing that showed me and everyone else exactly what she was, once and for all. There was sickness in the county. The same low-country fever that had taken Martha came up again with the last warm days, the way it did, and it got into the Purley place first, the Purleys, whose mother drank, whose boys Martha used to feed, one of whom had ridden up our road that Sunday to help take Sella away. And it laid the whole family down at once, the drunk mother and the 4 children, nobody left standing to fetch water or cool a fever, and no doctor to be had because the doctor was down at Kenyatta with the same sickness in a dozen houses. Word came up to us on a Thursday, brought by a neighbor going for help he wasn't going to find. The Purleys were dying, all of them, alone, 3 miles off, and there was a silence in our kitchen when the man rode on, because these were the people who'd hurt Ruth outside the church, whose kin had come to run Sella off, who'd said the ugly things in Holly's store that I'd started, and not one soul could have faulted Sella for staying home behind her own warm door and letting them reap what they'd sown. Sella was already packing the basket before the neighbor's dust had settled. You can't, I said, old words. Same 2 words I'd said to Elias on that first day, but I meant a different thing now. Sella, it's the fever. It's the same fever that I couldn't say Martha's name. You go in that house, you might not come out, and that's the house of people who— I know whose house it is, she said. She was wrapping bread in clean cloths and the roots she used moving fast. It is the house where children are dying with no one to hold water to their mouths. She looked up at me. Webb, when my son was dying on the road, do you know what I prayed? I prayed that somewhere ahead of us was a house with a woman in it who would not ask whose child he was before she helped him. Her hands didn't stop moving. There was no such house. I have decided to be one. And she went. Elias rode her over and stayed to help, and I went too. God help me, I went, because I could not sit in that kitchen while she did that. And I will not give you the particulars of those 4 days in the Pearly House, except to say they were the hardest 4 days I've known, and I've known some. Sella did not sleep. She moved between 5 sick beds like a woman with 6 hands. She cooled the fevers and forced the water and cleaned what the sickness made and sang, low, in her own language, to a drunk woman's frightened children through the worst of the nights. The language nobody in that county would let her speak in daylight, and it turned out to be the thing that soothed a dying child to sleep at 2 in the morning when nothing English would. The littlest Pearly girl died the second night. There was nothing to be done. She'd been too far gone before we came. Sella held her while she went, this child of the people who'd hated her, and washed her small body after and laid her out proper, and then went straight back to the 4 still living without stopping to fall apart, because there wasn't time, and falling apart is a thing you do later in a storeroom alone, where nobody counts it. The other 4 Pearlies lived. The mother too. They lived because a woman the county called a squaw walked into a house of the fever that had killed her own son, and would not leave until they did. And I stood in the wreck of that sick room on the 4th morning watching Sella sleep at last, sitting up in a chair with her chin on her chest, gray with exhaustion, and I understood that I had spent my whole life counting the wrong things. I'd counted nails and cattle and days without rain. I'd never once known how to count this, the worth of a person, the weight of a mercy, the exact size of what it costs to be kind to people who have been cruel to you. There's no column in a ledger for it. I'd have to learn to keep the account some other way. The Pearly mother, sober now and hollowed out, came to Sella before we left, stood in front of her twisting her apron, this woman who'd called her names, whose boy had ridden to run her off. And she couldn't get the words out, and Sella, who'd buried this woman's daughter with her own hands, just said, quiet, feed them well when they are strong enough. That is all, feed them. And the woman broke down entire, and Sella held her briefly, the way she held everyone, a little apart even in the holding, and then we went home. The county knew by Sunday. It moves fast, mercy, when it finally decides to move faster even than the ugly kind of talk. By the next week there wasn't a soul in Kenyatta who'd say the word squaw about Sella where I could hear it, and a couple who'd been loudest came, shame-faced, up our road with a ham and a sack of flour and mumbled things at the porch and left quick. Holly sent word by Caleb that anything the Ward place needed, his store would see to it, credit or no. Cutter, I heard, had gone quiet, gone somewhere down county, the way that kind does when the wind changes. It should have been the happy ending. The town come round, the stranger vindicated, the family healed and whole, and the warm table full every night, and the woman who filled it finally welcome in the country she'd saved a piece of. But I told you I keep an honest ledger. Because it was that same week, the week the county turned kind, the week she finally had everything she'd walked up that road on foot to find, a place among people who'd have her. It was that same week Sella sat down at the foot of the long table one evening after the children were asleep, with her sister's letter smoothed out in front of her, and looked at Elias at the head of it, and said the words I'd been dreading since October. I have to tell you something about the spring, when the roads open. And Elias Ward, who had buried a wife and lost his children and been given them all back by this woman, set down the tack he was mending, and looked at her across the whole length of that table Martha's hands had planed, and I saw him understand, before she said another word, that the thing he'd been most afraid of, and least let himself name, was about to come true. I stood in the dark of the hall where I had no business being, and I did not write it down. Some things you don't count. You just stand in the dark and hope. New human traits spotlighted. Sacrifice, collective action, the pearly fever nursing, plus compassion toward those who wronged her, different beat than part one's grief prejudice axis. The spring came the way it always does in that country, not gentle, not slow, but all at once and violent. The snow melt off the high ground, turning the dry washes into brown rivers overnight, and the whole world going green so fast it near hurt to look at. And on the first morning the road down to Kenyatta was passable again. I found Sella standing at the edge of the yard looking at that road like it was a debt come due. Her bundle was packed. It sat on the porch, the same bundle she'd walked up with in the dry month, no bigger. She'd taken nothing from that house in all her months of filling it, which is a thing I noticed and couldn't hardly stand. And she stood at the edge of the yard in the wet green morning with her shawl about her shoulders and her sister's letter, I knew, folded in her pocket, and she was saying goodbye to the road before she walked it, or maybe asking it something. I couldn't tell. I came up beside her. I'd stopped being able to keep away from her. Over the winter, the man who tried to run her off had turned into the man who couldn't leave her be. And if that isn't the whole sorry education of a hard heart, I don't know what is. You told him in the fall, I said. You've had all winter to go. The pass has been near closed since November. You could have waited them out at San Carlos, warm, with your sister. I was working something out as I said it. But you stayed the winter here. Why stay the winter if you were always going to walk down that road the first day it opened? She didn't answer right off. Down in the wash the brown water was loud. When I told Elias in the fall, she said, I told him I would go in the spring, and he said she stopped, started again. He said a thing to me, and I have spent the winter unable to answer it, so I stayed, to sit with it. The way I taught Ruth to sit with a thing simmering and not fret it. A small breath that was almost, not quite, a laugh. It has been simmering all winter, Webb. I do not know yet what it is. What he say to you? She looked at me, and she didn't tell me. She'd tell me nearly anything, that woman. In the end she'd shown me her sister's letter. She'd let me hear the worst of her losses through a dark hallway. But she wouldn't tell me what Elias Ward said to her that night in the fall. And I understood that some words are said once between two people, and belong to them, and no ledger and no listening old fool in a hallway. And I never did learn it directly, and I've made my peace with not knowing mostly. Come in for breakfast, she said. Whatever the day holds, no one walks a road hungry from my kitchen. She went in. I stood a minute longer in the wet yard, and I want to set down here what I understood standing there, because it's the closest I've come to wisdom in a long, hard life, and I don't want it lost when I am. I understood that I had it backwards, all winter, all those months. I've been dreading the spring like it was a thief coming to steal our happiness. But the happiness had never been ours to keep in the first place. Sella didn't belong to us. We'd been fed by her, all of us, the way you're fed by a season, and you don't own the spring just because it warmed you, and you've no right to curse it for moving on. The most you can do is be grateful you were standing in it while it lasted. I'd thought love was a thing you kept. Martha's table, my ledger, my counting, all of it was a man trying to keep things. And Sella had spent a whole winter teaching me, without one word of instruction, that love is mostly a thing you give away and then have the grace to let go of. I still didn't want her to leave. Understanding a thing and wanting it are two different countries. Here is how the last day went. I'll tell it plain and in order, because it's the last of the story and I don't want to rush it, and because every hour of it mattered. Breakfast was quiet and terrible. They all knew. The children had known since the fall. Sella wouldn't have kept it from them. She didn't lie to children ever, held that a body was owed the truth of a thing, especially when it was young. And they'd had all winter to be angry and to grieve it ahead of time, which is its own slow poison. Caleb was closed up hard as the day I met him, back in his too big coat of anger, sitting far down the table. Ruth kept getting up to fetch things nobody needed so she wouldn't have to sit still. And Sam. Sam had gone quiet again. Not all the way, not like the 4 months after his mother, but over that last week, as the roads dried, the boy's words had gone scarce and careful, and that morning he ate his bread without a sound, watching Sella with his whole ruined heart back up in his face, the way it had been the first day when he'd reached for the fringe of her shawl. He was 6, going on 7. He'd lost his mother and gone silent and come back to speech through this woman's patience. And now, he was watching the second mother of his short life pack a bundle by the door, and he did the only thing a child that age knows to do with a grief that big. He got smaller. He climbed into himself. And I thought, we all thought, I saw it on every face, that we were about to watch that boy lose his voice a second time, and this time maybe for good, because the well of a child's resilience is deep, but it is not bottomless, and Sam had drawn from his about as far down as a person can go. Elias didn't eat. He sat at the head of the table and he looked at his plate, and he was the man I'd met in the dry month again, the loud gone out of him, the big frame emptied, a man watching a thing come at him he couldn't rope or ride or doctor or break. Whatever he'd said to her in the fall, whatever answer he'd been waiting on all winter, he'd clearly decided it wasn't coming, and he was doing what that kind of man does with a loss he can't stop. He was going quiet and hard and getting ready to survive it alone. I knew the strategy well. It was mine. Elias hitched the wagon after breakfast to carry her to Kenyatta, where she'd catch on with a freighter going south toward the agency. And the loading of that one small bundle into that big empty wagon was about the worst thing I ever watched, and I've watched some. She said her goodbyes on the porch. She was steady. God, she was steady. She'd said harder goodbyes than this, to husbands and sons on cold roads, and she'd learned to say them without breaking because breaking was a luxury she'd never once been able to afford. She took Ruth's face in both hands and said something low that I didn't hear, and that turned Ruth's eyes bright, and Ruth nodded, fierce, holding onto whatever it was. She put her hand on Caleb's shoulder, the shoulder she'd set that day at the corral, and Caleb wouldn't look at her, jaw working, and she left her hand there a moment and said, "You are gentle now, under the anger. Do not let them tell you it is weakness. It saved the horse. It will save more than the horse," and she took her hand away, and Caleb stared at the floorboards and his throat moved and he said nothing, and it was the loudest nothing I ever heard. Then she knelt down in front of Sam. The way she had that first day, level with him. And Sam looked at her, silent, gone back down inside himself, and she didn't try to pull him up out of it, didn't say use your words or be brave or any of the things that shove a child further down. She just knelt there and looked at him with love and let him be exactly as broken as he was. And she took off her shawl, the good wool shawl with the fringe, the one he'd reached for the first day, the one thing of real worth she owned, and she wrapped it around his small shoulders and she said, "This is yours now, so you will always have something to hold." And she folded his hands into the fringe of it, the way he'd held it that first day, and she pressed his fingers closed around it. And Sam, silent Sam, gone back down the well, opened his mouth. And what came out was not a word. It was a sound, a high, thin, terrible sound, the sound a child makes when the grief is too big for words and always was, the sound he hadn't made even at his own mother's grave. And he threw his arms around Sella's neck and made that sound into her shoulder, and she gathered him up and stood, holding him, this boy who wasn't hers, who was the exact age her own son had been. And I watched her steadiness finally go, watched it crack right down the middle, watched 20 years of unaffordable grief break loose at once. And she held that wailing boy in the doorway of that house and wept, openly, the way she'd never let herself weep for her own. Nobody moved. It went on a long time. You don't interrupt a thing like that. You just stand and let it be what it is and be ashamed of every small cold thing you ever did that helped make a world where a woman had to hold her grief that long before she could set it down. And then, I'll tell you what happened, but I'll tell you first that I don't fully understand it, and I've decided that's all right, that some turns of a life aren't meant to be counted out and explained, only witnessed. Elia's ward came down off the porch. He'd been standing apart the way he did, gone hard and quiet, getting ready to drive her to town and drive back alone to a house she'd filled and would now empty by leaving. And he came down the steps slow, and he crossed to where she stood holding his weeping son, and he stopped in front of her. And he reached out and he put one big hand on Sam's back, and the other, after a moment, on Sella's shoulder. The two of them, his boy and this woman, gathered under his two hands. And he said loud at last, the loud all the way back in him, loud enough for all of us in the yard and the wet green hills to hear, he said, "Don't." Just that, the same word his son had said in that yard in the fall to the men on horses. The one word that means no, you cannot have this, no, you cannot take this away. Except Elias wasn't saying it to the county now. He was saying it to the road, to the spring, to his own long habit of surviving loss alone, to the woman herself, and to whatever she'd been unable to answer all winter. "Don't go," he said. "Sella, don't." And his voice broke on her name the way it had broken on the bread months back, and he didn't go out to the porch to hide it this time. He just let it break in front of God and his children and me. "I said it wrong in the fall. I said it like a man offering you work, a place. Like Webb did that first day, a job and a roof, like you was a hand. And you couldn't answer that, and I don't blame you because it wasn't the true thing." He stopped. He was a man who'd spent a lifetime not saying true things out loud, and he was hunting the words like they were stock scattered in a storm. "The true thing is this house was dying, and you didn't save it because it was your job. You saved it because he couldn't." He looked at Sam sobbing between them. He looked at Ruth in the doorway with both hands over her mouth again, and Caleb frozen on the steps, and he found it. "Because you love 'em. You love 'em, Sella. Anybody can see it but a fool, and I've been the fool all winter waitin' for you to say a thing I never gave you cause to say." The wash roared down in the green. Nobody breathed. "Stay," Elias said. "Not to work, not to keep house. Stay because there's a place at that table that's yours, not Martha's, God rest her, yours, and it's been yours since the night you sat down in it, and I've been too much a coward to say so." He swallowed. "Your sister's got her people, I know it. I know I got no right, but you got people here too if you'll have us. We're a poor scattered lot and half the county's still fools, and I can't offer you much but a hard place and 4 folks that," his voice went to almost nothing, "that grieve you gone every day of their lives, includin' me, most of all me." And Sella stood there in the wet morning with a weeping boy in her arms, and her shawl already given away, and her bundle already in the wagon, and her sister's letter in her pocket, and the whole cruel choice laid bare in front of everyone. Her own blood south down that road, and this borrowed broken family north of it. And I watched her face, and I want to tell you I saw her decide, clean and clear. But I didn't. That's the truth of it. What I saw was harder and more human than a clean deciding. I saw her look at the road, the long way south to the last of her blood, to old age among faces that knew her true name. And I saw her look at the boy in her arms who was her dead son's age and not her son. And I saw her understand, the way I'd understood in the yard, the way it takes a lifetime, that there is no answer that doesn't cost everything, that both roads led away from someone she loved, that to choose either one was to grieve, and that the only question left in the whole world was which grief she could carry and which she could not. She closed her eyes. She held the boy tighter. And she said something, low, in her own language, the language they'd made her hush in daylight, the language that had soothed the dying pearly child at 2 in the morning. She said it with her eyes closed and her face against Sam's hair, and none of us understood the words, and it didn't matter because you didn't need the words. She was talking to someone who wasn't there. Her husband, maybe. Her own lost boy. Her sister down the road she wasn't going to walk. Asking them, I think, to forgive her for what she was about to choose, or thanking them, or both. Then she opened her eyes and she looked at Elia's ward, and she said in English, so the children would understand it, so it would be plain and witnessed and true. "Then take the bundle back off the wagon." And that was all the answer she gave, and all the answer there was, and Ruth made a sound and ran to them, and Caleb came off the steps at last, and Elias gathered the whole broken mending lot of them in against himself in the wet green yard, and I stood off to the side where I'd stood the whole story, the man who tried to run her off, watching a family I'd near helped to break become, in front of me, a family again, larger now and stranger, and stitched together out of two different griefs that had found in each other something like a home. I'm an old man now, writing this out by a lamp in a house that isn't the Ward place anymore, though it's not far. They're all gone from that range now, in the way of things scattered again, but the good kind of scattering, the kind that's children grown and gone to their own lives and not soldiers on a road. Ruth married a decent man down near Kenyatta and feeds half that town at a long table of her own. She learned it at an elbow I could name. Caleb took to horses, gentle-handed, the way he was taught, and there's not a mean colt in 3 counties he can't talk down. Sam grew up and grew tall and never did talk a whole lot, but what he says is worth hearing, and he still has a certain wool shawl, worn to threads now, that he'd sooner lose his right arm than part with, and he won't explain it to anyone who has to ask. And Elias and Sella had their years. Not without cost. The county was slow to fully come round, and there were hard days, and blood down a southern road that Sella grieved to the end of her life. A sister she wrote to but saw only twice more. A choice that cost her something every single day, even as it gave her something every single day, which is the shape of every real choice a person ever makes. But they had their years, and their table stayed full, and I sat at it near every night. An old fool made welcome past all his deserving, until they too were gone. I have kept a ledger my whole life. I told you that at the start. Nails and calves and days since rain. And I've come to the end of my numbers now, and I find I remember almost none of them. Not the count of cattle, not the price of nails, not one figure I ever set down so careful. What I remember is a woman walking up a dry road on foot, carrying everything she owned, into a house that had no more use for anyone, and setting a table. That's the only sum that ever mattered. I could never have counted it. She had to teach me, over one long winter, that some things you don't count. You just sit down together. While you still can.